Was Tupac planning to leave Death Row Records? If you search this question online, you'll see that opinions are divided amongst the fans and also the people that knew him. Some people think Puck was unhappy with his record deal and wanted to take his career in a different direction, while others think that at Death Row, Puck had finally found the family he was looking for and was going to be loyal to the label until the end. My opinion is that Tupac was indeed planning to leave Death Row Records shortly before he was killed. He might not have had all the details worked out yet, but there are several clues that he was planning to leave the label, and in this video I'll lay out the evidence for this. Maveli Records. Tupac was planning to start his own record label, Maveli Records, named for the alias he'd given himself at Death Row. In his last full-length interview on August 24th, 1996, with Rob Marriott for Vibe magazine, Puck says the first release on the new label would be the Maveli album, which would later become known as the Donk Illuminati, followed by One Nation, which is the unfinished album Puck was working on at the time of his death.
And now I got Maveli Records, and Maveli is the first artist on that. And then One Nation is the second artist on that.
Tupac's intention to start his own record label is evidence that he was starting to think about independence from Death Row. It was likely that Maveli Records would have been a vanity label and subsidiary of Death Row Records, rather than an independent label, to start with anyway. This would have been necessary for the release of the Maveli album, because Puck needed this record to count as the last of the 3 albums he'd agreed to deliver for Death Row to fulfill his contract after double CD All Eyes on Me. In this scenario, Puck would have had some element of control of Maveli Records, and the brand name would be prominent on album artwork, no doubt. But a vanity label is usually partially or wholly owned by the parent label, in this case Death Row, which was itself owned by Interscope, and the parent label handles production, distribution and funding of the vanity label. This would have been similar to the arrangement Snoop Dogg had with Doggy Style Records, which also started as a subsidiary of Death Row. If this was the case for Maveli Records, Puck's music business dealings would probably still have been very closely tied with Suge Knight and Death Row, unless Puck planned for Maveli Records to be a subsidiary of a different label. More on that later. It's also interesting that Puck planned to release One Nation on Maveli Records with its message of unity between the East Coast and West Coast, like the new label perhaps marked a new chapter in his music career. And around this time, Tupac also swapped his Death Row pendant, which he wore everywhere, for a new, huge gold medallion, which bore the name Maveli, again, another symbolic break with Death Row Records. Euthanasia Production Company. In 1996, Tupac set up a production company called Euthanasia, which was to handle all of his media work, including his work as an actor. The company was run by his godmother, Yasmin Fula, who is also mother of Outlaws member Gaddafi, and producer Tracy Robinson. The logo for Euthanasia will be familiar to Puck fans, a black winged angel loading a Mac-10 submachine gun with a magazine made up of piano keys. This is the same image that appears on Puck's huge gold medallion that I mentioned earlier, which he wore in the last couple weeks of his life. The forming of his own production company is more evidence that Puck wanted independence from Death Row, especially to separate his movie income from the money he made as a recording artist. Gobi Rahimi, who produced and directed several of Tupac's music videos, recalls an incident where Tupac was yelling at Suge Knight because his $700,000 check for acting in the movie Gridlocked had gone to Suge instead of Puck. Despite the supposed brotherly bond between Puck and Suge, not getting the money he was rightfully owed would be a strong motivator for Puck to separate himself from Suge and Death Row. In addition to this, on August 27, 1996, Tupac sent a fax to Right Way Security, the company Suge hired to provide protection to his roster of artists. The brief message, which has the Euthanasia logo in the top left-hand corner, informed Reggie Wright, head of Right Way, that Tupac no longer required the company's protective services. And as well as all this, according to a legal complaint made by the Shakur estate after Puc's death, the same day he fired Right Way Security, Tupac also apparently sent a letter to his lawyer, David Kenner, advising him that his services were no longer required. Kenner, who had permission to receive Tupac's contracts and negotiate on his behalf, was also the lawyer for Death Row Records, which represented a huge conflict of interest because the same attorney represented both employee and employer. So in one day, Tupac had fired his Death Row security team and Death Row lawyer. Strong evidence that, at the very least, Pac wanted his own independent security and legal representation, which could have been a precursor to him leaving Death Row entirely. Engagement to Kidada Jones. In 1996, Tupac became engaged to Kidada Jones. Pac professed his love for Kidada by getting her name tattooed on his arm, warning enemies not to diss her in the lyrics to his song Made Niggas, and looks loved up posing together with her in several photos. However, despite Pac's professions of love for Kidada, I think there was more to it than that. I think this was also a power play on Tupac's part, a calculated move to bring him closer to one of the most powerful and influential black music executives in the industry, Kidada's father, Quincy Jones. Tupac had some unkind things to say earlier in his career about Quincy Jones and Jones' penchant for white women, but Pac later apologised for those remarks. Quincy not only had more power and money than Suge Knight, but he also had the reputation and industry connections that could open doors for Pac and take his career to the next level, whether that be acting, producing screenplays, developing new artists, bringing to fruition his business and charitable ideas, and who knows what else. The sky really could have been the limit for Pac, with Quincy Jones backing him. It's also no coincidence that Pac was working with producer QD3 before his death. QD3 is the son of Quincy Jones, and working with him was another way for Pac to insert himself in the Jones family and strengthen his relationship with Quincy. Interestingly, in the same Rob Marriott interview mentioned earlier, Pac mentioned signing New York rap duo Nice and Smooth to either Maveli Records or Quest Records, a new group Ghetto Stars, which he describes as an offshoot of the Outlaws, to Quest.
And now I got Maveli Records, and Maveli is the first artist on that. And then One Nation is the second artist on that. And then I'm signing Greg Nice and Smooth to either me or Quest. I got another group at Quest, Ghetto Stars, that's like an offshoot of the Outlaws.
Quest Records was run by Quincy Jones, so this suggests Pac may have already had discussions with Quest executives, or maybe even Quincy himself, about having some kind of A&R role at Quest Records. This could have foreshadowed Pac joining forces with the label as an artist too, either by Maveli Records being distributed by Quest, or Pac signing with Quest directly. The Orlando Anderson beatdown. The infamous beatdown of Crip gang member Orlando Anderson in Las Vegas on September 7th, 1996, which was initiated when Tupac sucker punched Anderson, may not immediately seem to be evidence that Pac was planning to leave Death Row, but I think it was part of Pac's plan. Hear me out. Pac had witnessed the hatred that disloyalty to Death Row resulted in when Dr. Dre decided to leave the label. Tupac himself even hated on Dre following his departure by accusing Dre of taking credit for other people's work and being a closet homosexual. I don't think Pac actually believed either of these things. I think he felt he had to say them to satisfy Suge, who was angry at Dre for leaving the label they started together. Tupac was therefore acutely aware of the trouble he could face from Suge by being disloyal to Death Row. So when the time came for Pac to leave the label, he needed to cover himself. He needed some immunity from the accusations of disloyalty he would face. I think in Pac's mind, the best way to do this was by being fiercely loyal to the label right up until the last moment, by repeatedly shouting out Death Row on songs and helping to promote Death Row East, the new East Coast faction of the company. But Pac also figured that he would demonstrate his loyalty beyond music on a street level by attacking Orlando Anderson. Anderson was not only a member of the Southside Compton Crips, a rival gang to the Mob Piru affiliated Death Row Records, but Anderson also had a personal altercation a few months prior with Trayvon Lane, one of the Death Row entourage in Vegas that night. By attacking Anderson, Tupac could demonstrate his loyalty to Suge's Mob Piru homeboys and also had protection from any accusations of disloyalty when leaving death row, by being able to say to Suge something like, "I'm loyal to you on a deeper level than just music. I put my life on the line for you by repping the mob." Sadly for Puck, buying this insurance policy against perceived disloyalty to the label involved gambling with his life. And unfortunately, Puck lost the gamble when Anderson caught up with him a few hours later and got deadly revenge. So there you have it, 4 clues that Tupac was secretly planning to leave Death Row Records. As I said at the start, I don't think Puck had all of the details worked out, and he probably hadn't discussed it with Suge Knight yet. But Suge would have realised that something was wrong when Puck fired his Death Row security and Death Row lawyer. So Puck would have had no choice but to tell Suge very soon. And, if they could have worked things out, maybe Puck would have announced to the public that he was leaving Death Row in early 1997, which was the original planned release date for the Maveli album. But what do you think? Do you agree with me that Puck was planning to leave Death Row? Or do you think he was going to renew his contract and stay with the label for longer? Let me know in the comments below.